Welcome to the GRESB training program. This video provides an overview of the infrastructure assessments and explain how they can be used and by whom. In this presentation, we'll look at an overview of the main infrastructure investing structures. Then we'll introduce the infrastructure assessments and describe their structure and application in the context of infrastructure investing. Let's consider how investors invest in infrastructure. There are a variety of ways in which fund managers and investors can invest in infrastructure. There are fund managers that operate infrastructure funds, which invest in infrastructure assets. For example, Fund Manager A and Fund Manager B. There are also investors that invest in these infrastructure funds. For example, Investor A invests in Fund A, and Investor B invests in both Fund A and Fund B. Then, there are also investors that invest directly into assets, like Investor C. Finally, there are even fund-of-fund structures like this, where Investor D invests in Fund C, which in turn invests in Funds A and B. Now let's take a look at how the GRESB infrastructure assessments fit into this. To cater to this variety of investment structures, GRESB provides two complementary infrastructure assessments, a fund assessment and an asset assessment. Both address critical aspects of ESG performance through a globally applicable and standardized reporting and benchmarking framework. Investors do not complete any assessments, but can get access to the results of fund and asset assessments to assist with the monitoring of their investments and engagement with their managers. It is worth briefly mentioning that in the fund-of-fund example shown before, we generally treat fund-of-fund managers like investors. As such, they do not complete an assessment, but can get access to the results of their investments instead. The fund assessment is intended for infrastructure funds, being portfolios of assets, and the asset assessment is completed by the individual underlying assets, the portfolio companies. Both assessments consist of management and performance components, but it is important to note that a fund does not complete a performance component itself. Instead, the underlying assets of the fund provide the performance component for the fund assessment. If more than 25% of the fund's underlying assets complete the infrastructure asset assessment, the scores of these assets are averaged and the fund will obtain a performance score for the infrastructure fund. The asset assessment can therefore be relevant to investors as either A, a contribution to the overall fund assessment, or B, in its own right in the case of direct investment into the asset. For the asset scores to contribute to the performance score of a participating fund, the fund must be linked to the asset. There is a simple process for this that is described in another training lesson. Once assessments are submitted and undergo our validation process, participants will receive a series of scores on their scorecard. In order to obtain a GRESB score, both the management and performance components need to have been submitted. If only one of these components is submitted, then only the respective score of the submitted components will appear. So either a management component score or a performance component score. This is applicable for both funds and assets. As a reminder, the performance component score of the fund is the weighted average asset score of the fund's underlying assets. Thank you for taking the time to complete this lesson. We hope that it helped you understand the GRESB infrastructure assessments and how they can be used. For any questions, you can contact us at gresb.com/contact.